do anything he wanted to her. Then Sarah was hard on Hagar, and Hagar ran away. Remember, she had no control over circumstances. She belonged to Abraham and Sarah. She could only comply. That was all she had left. Comply and do what was required. Now, as a result of Sarah's proposal that Abraham had sexual relations with Hagar, this was about to bring tension between Sarah and Hagar. And when we see this text, all the parties involved didn't handle the situation particularly well. Hagar despises Sarah. And of course, Sarah, who does she blame? Abraham. But I was only doing what you told me to do. And yet, what was Abraham's response? If I put it in everyday thinking today, Abraham doesn't want to know about it and says to Sarah, you handle it. That's basically what he's saying. I don't want to know. I did what you wanted. It's your problem. You solve it. So Sarah does. She takes it out on Hagar. She gives her a hard time. With the result that Hagar, while pregnant, runs away to escape the mistreatment and injustice that had happened to her. Now, does anyone know what Hagar means? That's interesting. All our names have a meaning, but Hagar means flight or wanderer. That's what her name means, flight or wanderer. And so she runs away from Sarah. At this point in time, she'd had enough of being used. And she expressed herself by giving Sarah a hard time. And by that I mean, she had an attitude problem towards her mistress. I gave your husband something you couldn't. Sarah wanted a child badly, and she wasn't able to have it. And here is Hagar, the servant girl with no control over her circumstances. Her husband gets her pregnant, so she feels she's slightly superior in that respect. And you can imagine the tension between these two women. It only grew. Now, in hindsight, I wonder if Hagar had shown a better attitudes towards Sarah, then well, maybe things might have been just a little different. Something I can only speculate on. But Sarah was wrong in her response and her actions to Hagar. I mean, when you come to think about it, whose plan was it in the first place for Abraham to have sexual relationships with Hagar? Sarah. Now, Hagar was never consulted and asked what she thought about it. Had it been Sarah's proposal, yet I notice Abraham didn't disagree with the proposal. It seems he was a willing participant. But you know what? He wasn't going to cop the blame for what had happened between the two women. And he wants them to work it out for themselves. And so I think Hagar still felt the pain of being mistreated. She still felt abandoned by those who should have been responsible for her. Yet, she is responsible for the way she responds to her circumstances, just as you and I are. We can't control those circumstances. We all contribute sometimes to the pain we're experiencing, but it doesn't change the fact that God still sees us in our circumstances, and He does care about us. It doesn't change. In our next slide, it's confronting challenge in the verses, just two. The angel of the Lord found Hagar beside a spring of water in the desert by the road to Shur. And the angel said, Hagar, Sarah's slave girl, where have you come from? Where are you going? Hagar answered, I'm running away from my mistress Sarah. It's at this point in our text that we find God chooses. He chooses the time, He chooses the place to intervene in the life of Hagar. Hagar had made the decision She's better off out of this situation she was in. So she decided to run away from it. Put it behind her. Maybe she could start out with a fresh slate somewhere else. At this point, God steps into her life when she least expected it. Here she is, she's angry, she's resentful at what she had suffered. She's not expecting or asking to hear the voice of God intervening in her life anytime soon. He's somewhere in the background, but he's not in the forefront. And so the angel of the Lord finds her near a spring in the desert, close to the road leading towards Egypt. So her plan is to go back to Egypt. That's a home. That's a plan. She's pregnant. She's in the desert. It doesn't look as though she's going to make it. She's in a great deal of pain. She is indeed a person in need. And so the angel confronts her with two challenging questions. Hagar, servant of Sarah, where have you come from? Where are you going? Interesting question. And one of the things I found in the text, Hagar is never mentioned by name by Sarah and Abraham. She's never called by name. She's referred only to as a maidservant. It seems they never saw her as a person, but God does. And the first thing he does, he calls her by her name, Hagar. And I wonder how this would have impacted Hagar. She hears the voice calling her name. Nobody else had called her. And she hears this voice calling her name. Somebody knows my name. He calls me by my own name. And it's interesting to think, in the whole universe, there is somebody who knows you by name. There is somebody who sees your pain, who sees your frustration this morning, and he chooses the time that he comes and intervenes in your life. Now, not only does he call her by name, but he addresses her as the servant of Sarah. In other words, he knows what she does. And whether Hagar likes it or not, this is what she is. She is a servant of Hagar. And God doesn't sugarcoat the reality of things where people are like and what they should be doing. We can have many programs that tell us how to build up our self-esteem and everything else, but it really doesn't change who and what we are. And here, she was running away from a situation that she didn't like. She was called by her name, and she was reminded that she was a servant. She belonged to another. Now, the first question is, where are you coming from, Hagar? And she answers, I'm running away from my present situation. Thinking to herself, if only you knew, if you're in my position, you would be doing the same thing. You wouldn't be staying here. You would be running away as well. So I'm running away from the pain. I'm running away from the injustice and the ill treatment. I can't take it anymore. I've had enough. I just need to get away. And she wants to go to Egypt, to go home. But the question is, what's waiting for her in Egypt? She was a slave girl that belonged to Pharaoh. She was taken from a family. What has she got waiting there? She is running from a current situation. She doesn't like it, so she runs away. She doesn't want to put up with it. And this is what we tend to do as human beings. We run away from whatever is troubling us rather than confronting and dealing with it. You know, it's easier to run than what it is to stand and confront and deal with situations. And so this can become a habit that as human beings we embrace. Run away as soon as we have a problem instead of dealing with it so that it no longer becomes a problem. It's dealt with. And you know, as human beings, we take so long to learn that lesson. We run away from something we don't like instead of dealing. And we're running and running and running. If we just stopped and dealt with it and confronted it, the problem's gone. There's no reason for us to run anymore. The second question asks, where are you going to, Hagar? Where was she going to? Now, she thought she was going to Egypt. But the reality is, Hagar had no idea where she was going or what she was going to do when she gets there. Her first response is simply, I want to get out of here. I want out of my present situation and my present circumstances. But I'm going somewhere, and I'll worry about where that is when I get there. How many people do that? I'm just going to go. I just want out. And when I get there, that's when I'll decide what I'm going to do. Well, that's not how life works. You tend to run into greater problems and more difficulties. And this is where God steps in. He intervenes. And what does he say to Hagar? What wonderful counsel and advice does he give a woman who has got no control, had a hard time? What does he tell her? You've got to be joking. What sort of advice is that? Now, in our politically correct day today, if I gave you that advice, you could sue me because you didn't like it. But here, God is saying, go back, deal with your problems, face them, work through them. I know they're difficult, but it'll be worthwhile in the long term. Now, Hagar, I'm sure she would have had a hard time getting her head around all of this. To go back to some place that she didn't want, to people she didn't like, who she felt didn't appreciate them. She probably thought, you don't know what you're asking me to do. Now, God's point in the question is to awaken her conscience. What does the future hold for you, Hagar? You have no idea what you're doing. You have no idea what will happen to you and your son, do you? That's what he's asking. You don't know what the future holds for you or your son. And then God assures her he has a plan for her and his son, her son, and she needs to trust him. There's the next one. A command to cooperate in verses 9 to 12. The angel of the Lord said to her, go home to your mistress and obey her. The angel also said, I'll give you so many descendants they cannot be counted. The angel added, you are now pregnant and you'll have a son. You will name him Ishmael because the Lord has heard your cries. Ishmael will be like a wild donkey. He'll be against everyone and everyone will be against him. He will attack all his brothers. Wow, what a decision. Go back. If you're in Hagar's position, what would you do? Would you consider it? Really, we can't, because we're not in that situation. But I want you to imagine the stress and the tension that's involved in her life. Very painful on all levels, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. Particularly hard for a young woman who has been scarred and wounded by the circumstances of life and been mistreated by those who were responsible for her. But Hagar makes an important discovery in her hour of need. And this is something that all mothers and every human being needs to understand. She's not alone. She's not alone. She's cared for and she's loved by God, a God who she hardly knows or understands. He intervenes in her life. And he's asking these questions. Where are you going? And that's a challenging question for a lot of mothers and people today. Where are you going? What does the future hold for you? Or your children? Or your grandchildren? Where are they going? Where are you going? But it would have been hard for her to get her head around the fact that someone cared for her. She'd never been consulted about what she thinks she should do or what she'd like to do. And yet here in this situation, she's given a command, go back and do the very thing you don't want to do. Yeah, right. Think about in your life, how many times has there been a situation that it's easier to run away from rather than stand and confront and deal with it? You know, most of us would rather run. And then we're told, go back and fix it up. No way. And God's asking her to do the very thing she doesn't want to do. And sometimes God will ask us to do the very thing we don't want to do. Many people have been in situations and they don't want to do what they've been asked to do. They won't allow themselves to go back and submit to those who were over them. After all, I have my rights, I have my freedoms. And you get to the point in choosing to do what God wants you to do, or you can go your own way and do your own thing. And that's where most people find themselves doing. They have to think about it. Return to Sarah, your mistress, and submit to her. Think about it. You're asking me to go back to that woman and submit to her? Well, I'm not going to do it. You can't ask me to do such a thing. And that's what we would say. That's what we'd think. You're just asking something that's too hard. So many people have doubts and run away from conflicts and problems they have with others rather than dealing with them. And I think in many respects, she missed the point of what God said to her. Because God gave her a promise. I will multiply your offspring. They cannot be numbered. He's saying, I have a plan for you and your son. They have a future. They'll be blessed. But you know what? You must trust me and believe that I know what I'm doing. Go back, face those difficulties. You have a future, and so does your son. And the choice is yours. Will you trust me? Will you believe that it's going to work out or not? So often you and I have option B, C, and D if option A doesn't work out. That's how we're wired. But God doesn't want option B, C, or D. He just wants option A. He wants obedience. And that obedience comes because of trust, because of her faith. She was being asked to exercise her faith, to show her obedience and do what God commanded, no matter how difficult it may be. She is even told her son is to be named. She didn't get to name him. You shall name your son Ishmael. Our text doesn't say, look, Hagar, God has listened to your prayer, because I don't think Hagar had even thought of praying at that time. All she was focused on was running away from a situation. She hadn't stopped to thought and pray to someone she hardly knew. And our text says God has listened to your affliction. He's seen your pain. He's seen your suffering. He has seen your tears. He's heard your unanswered questions. What does Ishmael mean? Anyone know? It's irony, really. It means God has heard. God has heard. What did he hear? A mother's cry. God has heard. Every time she called his name, Ishmael, Ishmael, what would she be reminded of? God has heard, God has heard, God has heard. And indeed, God had heard her cries. And maybe as a mother this morning, you've had many cries, many pain, many frustrations, and you don't think anyone has heard. Somebody has. But God has a purpose and a plan for your life and those of your children. And you might be experiencing difficulties in the family situation, even amongst children, etc. And God says, face up to them, confront them and deal with them. I have a purpose. I have a plan. Don't run away and don't give up. So many are willing to give up and quit because it's hard. And God doesn't make any, he doesn't say, well, look, that's okay, I understand. No, he wants you to do the difficult things because he knows what's coming and he knows the future. In our next one, there's a conscious consideration in verses 13 to 16. It says, the slave girl gave a name to the Lord who spoke to her. You are God who sees me. Because she said to herself, have I really seen God who sees me? So the well there between Kadesh and Bered was called Beer Lahai Roi. Now it's not a well full of beer. Hagar gave birth to a son for Abram, and Abraham named him Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar gave birth to Ishmael. Now it's interesting. In our text before, God had called Hagar by name. And now Hagar gives God the name as the one who sees me. This is how she comes to know God. He's the one who sees me. He's the one who heard my cries. He's the one that came to me in my time of need. He's the one that gave me a promise concerning myself and my son. So she's beginning to understand who this God is. And it reflects a personal relationship that had developed between God and her. But not only does she give God a new name, but the place where he found her receives a new name as well. And that name means the well of the living one who sees me. Not full of beer, but it's the well of the one who sees me. Hagar will go from being a single, expectant mom to a mother raising her child. Now, she's told, go back. And I want to say this to you. It's not like the fairy tales that we have, and they go back and they live happily ever after. No problems. This didn't happen because she did go back. And there's conflict that continues between Hagar and Sarah. And you know what? There'll be conflict that will continue between Ishmael and Isaac. There will be conflict that will continue between their descendants. And who are their descendants today? The Arab and the Jewish nations. Are they in peace and not? They love one another, right? No, there's conflict. God is true to his word. It's all a part of God's plan being revealed. So she didn't live happily ever after, but she did live satisfied that God kept his promise, as we'll find out next week. But Hagar had to make a choice. Was she going to be obedient? Was she going to do what God commanded, even though it was hard, even though it meant more tension between Sarah? Because really they never got along. And we're going to meet people in our lives who we just don't get along with. Maybe we don't get along with our parents. I wonder how many teenagers have had fights with their parents, had disagreements, have not spoken to their parents for some time. If my mother was here, she would tell me, well, there's one up there. We had disagreements, but we managed to deal with them over a period of time. And we are closer now than what we've ever been. But we have to do things. And God has said, face up to it and deal with it. It doesn't mean that those persons are going to love you or embrace you. They'll still be thorny. They might still be difficult. But I've got a purpose and a plan for your life. The Bible makes it plain that in the real world in which we live, there's always going to be ongoing problems and difficulties that are faced by all mothers, whether they're single, whether they're married. There'll be frustrations between wives and flawed husbands and troubled children. God does say, look, come to Jesus, you live happily. He doesn't say this. Look, come to Jesus and guess what? Give your life to him and you live happily ever after. He'll take care of all your problems. Trust me. You will live a happy and satisfied and problem-free life. Do you believe that? Isn't that what he promises? That's what people say and think. If they come to Jesus, give him all their problems, life will be sweet. But that's not what Jesus says. He doesn't say that at all. What he does say is the same that he said to Hagar, my grace is sufficient for you. Wow. He also said that to Paul. In other words, he's saying here, whatever your need is, I'll supply it on a daily basis. The question is, will you trust me? Will you trust that I know what I'm doing? And if you do, come follow me in the journey of life. Take my hand and let's see where it leads. And that's what Jesus says to us. Come, follow me. Throughout the New Testament, I'm going to mention this a little bit tonight, but we, I guess as preachers, make it easier. You come to Jesus, put your faith and trust in him, accept him and make a decision. But you know, looking through the New Testament, you do in a sense make a decision to follow Christ. But Jesus just said, come follow me. Come follow me. And whatever that might mean. And that's what he says to us today. Come follow me. He doesn't say, I'm going to take all your problems away. He says, take up your cross daily and follow me. Deny yourself and follow me. Now, we like the idea of coming to Christ and, well, getting rid of our problems. But to take up our cross on a daily basis and deny ourselves, that's not really what I had in mind. And you know what the Christian life is all about? Is come, follow me. Mothers, where have you come from? Where are you going today? You may feel like Hagar, alone and abandoned, used, abused, and rejected by others. You may even feel that you're worthless and no one cares. But the truth is, God cares and loves you. He sees you. He knows you. He hears your affliction. But will you trust his promises? Will you embrace his strength and live in his grace? And know that as a mother, you are cherished. Your children will be blessed because of your faith and your example. Where are you going, mothers? Will you put your trust in God today? You might feel that, well, nobody cares. What's the purpose? God cares. He's put you in this position. He will intervene and he will give you everything you need. It doesn't mean that he's going to smooth over and take away the problems, but he gives you strength to get through those problems, and he gives you a promise that he's there with you, a promise for the future, and a promise as a mother that your faith and example will be a shining light to your children. So don't quit. Don't give up. It's worthwhile. Next week, he has another question